Here are the Beach Boys.
For more than 2 decades, Ed Sullivan stood at the center of American television like a quiet monarch. Every Sunday night, over 50 million Americans gathered around their screens. Families trusted him, parents trusted him, networks trusted him. When Ed Sullivan introduced someone, that person didn't just perform, they were endorsed by America itself. One appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show could turn an unknown into a household name overnight. Careers were launched, legacies were sealed, and reputations were burnished with a single handshake and a polite introduction. Behind the scenes, Sullivan was known as the gatekeeper. "If Ed booked you," a former producer once said, "America knew your name the next morning." But what the audience never saw was the notebook. According to longtime staff, Sullivan kept quiet records, not just about talent, but about behavior. About things said backstage, about demands whispered to producers, about attitudes that never made it past the curtain. After certain performers left the building, Sullivan would turn to his staff and say only one thing: "That's the last time they're on my stage." It wasn't diva behavior that disturbed him. It wasn't ego. It wasn't even controversy. What haunted Sullivan were the moments when performers he had introduced as heroes revealed something darker, documented racism, segregationist demands, and hypocrisy that directly contradicted the values his show claimed to represent. Clean-cut idols who built fortunes on black music while opposing integration, patriotic icons who sang about America while excluding black Americans from it. Beloved entertainers whose images concealed attitudes Sullivan found deeply troubling. And at the very top of that list, the one Sullivan would later call "the biggest mistake I ever made," stood the performer he helped crown king. But to understand how that regret formed, we need to start at the bottom of the list. Number 9. The wholesome alternative. The safe face of rock and roll. The clean-cut singer America trusted. Pat Boone. The clean-cut star who profited from black music and opposed integration. When Pat Boone stepped onto the Ed Sullivan stage, America saw exactly what it wanted to see: a bright smile, white buck shoes, perfect manners. Sullivan presented Boone as the antidote to Elvis Presley, a safer, cleaner alternative to what many parents feared was dangerous rock and roll. Boone looked like traditional values made flesh, but behind that image was a carefully engineered business model. Between 1955 and 1959, Boone scored massive hits by recording songs originally created by black artists. Ain't That a Shame by Fats Domino, Tutti Frutti, and Long Tall Sally by Little Richard. Boone's versions were stripped of their energy, sanitized for white radio, and rushed to market. Music historians later documented how Boone's label closely monitored black artists, then sent Boone into the studio to record watered-down versions white radio stations would play, while the originals were pushed into race record categories. Little Richard later described watching Boone's Tutti Frutti climb the charts while his own original was sidelined. "He made my songs into nursery rhymes," Richard wrote. "He took everything that made them alive and made them safe for white people." Boone became wealthy. The original artists did not. What disturbed Sullivan even more was Boone's documented opposition to integration. In the late 1950s, Boone publicly supported segregationist policies. According to Sullivan's show staff, when Sullivan considered booking a black musical guest on the same episode, Boone's management made it clear he preferred not to appear on integrated programs. Sullivan was reportedly disturbed enough to consider canceling Boone's appearance altogether. Sullivan's wife, Sylvia, later recalled Ed watching Boone perform from the wings, shaking his head, troubled by the disconnect between the wholesome image and the reality behind it. Boone never publicly acknowledged the ethical issues behind his success. He never advocated for the artists whose work built his career. And Sullivan came to see those bookings as mistakes, decisions that prioritized ratings over integrity. While Boone wrapped racism in polite commercialism, the next performer did something even more shocking. She wrapped it in patriotism. Number 8. Kate Smith, the patriotic voice, who sang racist songs. When Kate Smith appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, America didn't just see a singer, they saw a symbol. Her booming, emotional rendition of God Bless America had become inseparable from national pride itself. Sullivan introduced her as the voice of the nation, a performer who seemed to embody unity, sacrifice, and American values. But buried beneath that image was a history most viewers never knew, and one Sullivan himself would later regret being associated with. Decades before her Sullivan appearances, Smith had recorded explicitly racist material. In 1931, she recorded "That's Why Darkies Were Born," a song whose lyrics openly romanticized slavery and justified racial hierarchy. The recording remained preserved in radio archives, largely forgotten by the public until historians resurfaced it years later. That wasn't an isolated case. Music historians documented multiple early recordings in which Smith performed songs reinforcing racist stereotypes. Contemporary reviews from the 1930s also described her appearing in blackface during some radio performances, a practice she continued into the late 1930s. By the time she stood on Sullivan's stage, those recordings were not widely known, but her behavior hadn't changed. According to civil rights organizations and backstage accounts, Smith insisted on performing only for segregated audiences well into the 1950s. In 1956, she reportedly canceled a performance rather than sing for an integrated crowd. On The Sullivan Show itself, staff documented her demands: white-only backup singers, white musicians, black stagehands kept out of sight during her performance. One stage manager recalled a 1960 incident in which Smith objected to black crew members being visible while she sang. Sullivan was deeply conflicted. By the late 1950s, he had begun deliberately featuring more black performers: Nat King Cole, Pearl Bailey, Sammy Davis Jr. Smith's demands stood in direct contradiction to the direction he believed television needed to move. Yet he still accommodated her, fearing on-air conflict. Privately, his discomfort grew. According to Sylvia Sullivan, Ed would quietly remark, "She sings about America, but she only means part of it." When Smith's racist recordings resurfaced publicly years later, the shock was widespread. Sullivan himself had never heard those specific songs, but he had seen enough backstage to regret the legitimacy his platform had given her. She remained America's patriotic voice. The contradictions were rarely mentioned. While Smith cloaked exclusion and patriotism, the next performer hid his behind something even harder to criticize: a smile, a calm voice, and a reputation as television's nicest man. Number 7. Perry Como, Mr. Nice Guy, and the quiet erasure of black performers. When Perry Como appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, there was nothing threatening about him. He was calm, relaxed, unfailingly pleasant. America knew him as Mr. Relaxation. Sullivan presented him as the perfect gentleman, a performer who embodied harmony in a tense era. But behind that serene image was something far more deliberate. For 15 years, during the height of the civil rights movement, Perry Como hosted one of television's most popular programs. According to NBC Diversity Records, that show featured virtually no black performers, not as guest stars, not as musicians, not even as backup singers. Production documents later revealed that Como had approval rights over guest bookings and musical arrangements. Proposals for black performers were repeatedly rejected, often with vague notes suggesting they were not a fit. In a 1957 incident documented by his musical director, Como reportedly dismissed the idea of integrated backup singers for a Christmas special, saying his audience expected a certain kind of show. That phrase became a pattern. Touring contracts from the early 1960s explicitly specified all-white orchestras. Promoters confirmed that black musicians were excluded by design, not accident. On the Sullivan stage, staff noticed something else. Como became visibly uncomfortable when scheduled on episodes with black performers. A stage manager recalled him timing his arrival and exit to minimize backstage interaction. Sullivan noticed. According to a producer, Ed would sometimes book Como alongside black artists intentionally, testing how he would respond. Como remained professional on camera, but backstage his discomfort was unmistakable. What made this particularly troubling was the contradiction. Como's musical style was deeply influenced by black jazz and blues traditions, yet he never publicly credited those influences. never used his enormous platform to elevate the people whose music shaped his sound. By the early 1960s, Sullivan quietly reduced Como's appearances. No explanation was ever given publicly. The image of Mr. Nice Guy remained intact. The erasure stayed invisible. But the next performer didn't erase quietly. He erased everyone for more than 3 decades. Number 6, Lawrence Welk, the band leader who hired only whites for 31 years. When Lawrence Welk appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, he seemed almost impossible to criticize. His thick accent, gentle smile, and cheerful demeanor projected pure wholesomeness. Sullivan introduced him as a band leader who made music for everyone: champagne music, family music, safe music. But behind that image was one of the most systematic and enduring examples of racial exclusion in American television history. From 1951 to 1982, Lawrence Welk led a nationally televised orchestra for 31 consecutive years. During that entire time, his orchestra employed exactly 0 black musicians, not one. According to later interviews with musicians who auditioned, this was not coincidence, it was policy. A black trumpet player who auditioned in 1965 recalled being told plainly that Welk preferred to keep the orchestra traditional. The meaning was immediately clear. Network diversity reports repeatedly flagged The Lawrence Welk Show as one of the least diverse programs on television, even as other productions began slowly integrating in the late 1950s and 1960s. Former orchestra members confirmed that Welk personally reviewed hiring decisions. Everyone knew the rule. Larry wanted a certain look, one musician later admitted. Black musicians didn't fit that look. What troubled Sullivan most was Welk's complete lack of awareness. Unlike others who hid their exclusion or justified it politically, Welk genuinely seemed puzzled that anyone would question his practices. To him, an all-white orchestra was simply maintaining a style, not enforcing segregation. On Sullivan's increasingly integrated stage, the contrast became glaring. A 1964 incident reportedly crystallized Sullivan's discomfort. Welk commented that Sullivan's orchestra looked different than what he was used to, a remark staff understood as thinly veiled unease with integration. Sullivan began referencing Welk privately as an example of how entertainment was resisting change. Yet publicly, Welk's reputation remained untouched. When he died in 1992, obituaries praised his warmth and musical legacy. Few mentioned the 3 decades of deliberate exclusion that defined his television empire. But while Welk represented institutional segregation, the next performer embodied something older and more explicit: entertainment's original sin. Number 5, Sophie Tucker, the vaudeville star who built fame in blackface. When Sophie Tucker walked onto the Ed Sullivan stage, she was treated like royalty. She wasn't just a performer, she was living history. Sullivan introduced her as a pioneer, a survivor of vaudeville's golden age, a woman who had paved the way. But that legacy carried something deeply uncomfortable. Tucker's early career was built in part on blackface performances, a practice she continued well into the 1920s. Vaudeville historians documented that theater managers pushed her into blackface because they believed her appearance limited her appeal. The makeup, they argued, allowed audiences to focus on her voice. Tucker accepted that logic. In her own 1945 autobiography, she described blackface as mere stage makeup, no different from any other costume. Even decades later, she expressed no regret. What made this particularly troubling was the music itself. Tucker's singing style was heavily influenced by black jazz and blues performers. She studied them, imitated them, and then presented those styles to white audiences who would not attend performances by black singers themselves. Multiple testimonies from black musicians described exploitative relationships. A pianist who worked with Tucker in the 1930s recalled her taking credit for arrangements he created. Others described being treated as hired help rather than collaborators. By the time Tucker appeared on Sullivan's show, she had abandoned blackface. Her attitudes, however, had not evolved. A 1959 backstage incident documented by a stage manager recorded Tucker remarking that a young black singer waiting nearby wouldn't have been allowed backstage in my day. She added that maybe things were better when Everyone knew their place. That moment reportedly changed Sullivan's perception. What had once felt like nostalgic reverence shifted into disappointment. By the early 1960s, Sullivan had begun consciously featuring more black performers. Tucker's worldview belonged to an earlier century. Her final appearance came in 1963. Sullivan remained courteous, but privately decided it was time to stop elevating entertainers whose attitudes contradicted the future he believed television should serve. Yet the next performer proved that even the supposed rebels of rock and roll carried their own contradictions. Number 4. The Rolling Stones, the blues-loving rebels who demanded all-white backstage crews. When the Rolling Stones appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in the mid-1960s, American audiences saw something electric. Here were the British bad boys who openly worshipped American blues. Mick Jagger spoke reverently about Muddy Waters. Keith Richards called black blues guitarists his teachers. They even named their band after a Muddy Waters song. On camera, everything about their image suggested deep respect for black musical tradition. Backstage, the picture was far more complicated. According to multiple Sullivan Show staff members, the Stones were visibly uncomfortable around black crew members. During their appearances, management reportedly requested that their dressing rooms be handled only by white staff, creating tension with Sullivan's increasingly integrated production team. A stage manager later recalled that these requests weren't framed as demands, they were presented as preferences. But the message was unmistakable. What troubled Sullivan was the contradiction. Publicly, the Stones spoke about black music with near religious devotion. Privately, they maintained segregated social spaces that excluded the very people whose culture they profited from. That contradiction extended beyond television. In a 1965 Melody Maker interview, Mick Jagger made remarks about black neighborhoods that relied on offensive stereotypes. When black British musicians criticized the comments, Jagger dismissed them as observations rather than apologizing. Keith Richards, meanwhile, praised black musicians using language that reduced artistry to biology, describing natural rhythm and instinct, rather than acknowledging technical mastery and innovation. The Stones made millions covering black blues songs. Muddy Waters struggled financially. When the band toured the American South in the mid-1960s, they performed in segregated venues without protest. While they did not enforce segregation themselves, their willingness to accept it quietly revealed where their priorities lay. Sullivan recognized their commercial value, but privately, his discomfort grew. He understood that giving them a platform also meant endorsing a version of musical respect that did not extend to people. Yet even that contradiction paled in comparison to the next performer, someone America didn't just admire, but felt sorry for. Number 3. Judy Garland, the tragic icon who used racial slurs backstage. When Judy Garland appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, Sullivan treated her differently. She wasn't introduced with hype, she was introduced with care. Garland was Hollywood's most sympathetic figure, the child star broken by MGM, the woman battling addiction, the survivor audiences wanted to protect. Sullivan understood her fragility and shielded her whenever possible, but behind the curtain was a reality that shocked those who witnessed it. Multiple musicians who worked on Garland's 1960s concert tours later documented her casual use of racial slurs during rehearsals and backstage moments, particularly when frustrated or under the influence. A pianist who toured with her in 1964 described her using offensive language during sound checks, creating visible discomfort among the integrated band. Garland showed little awareness or concern about the harm her words caused. Her relationship with Lena Horne revealed another layer. While Garland publicly praised Horne's talent, MGM records show she never advocated for equal billing or equal promotional treatment, despite having influence. Praise did not translate into action. The Judy Garland Show, 1963-60 Bauer, aired at a time when other variety programs were beginning to integrate more meaningfully. Garland's show featured very few black performers, and when it did, they were rarely given equal narrative space. A 1967 nightclub incident in New York further exposed her attitudes. Multiple witnesses documented Garland making derogatory remarks about black audience members she believed were being disruptive, comments that stunned nearby staff. What made Garland's behavior particularly painful was the symbolism. She had become an icon for marginalized communities, proof that survival was possible. The discovery that she harbored racist attitudes revealed a difficult truth. Being victimized does not automatically create empathy for others. Sullivan initially dismissed early reports, hoping they were exaggerations, but consistent accounts from trusted staff eventually convinced him. Garland died in 1969, her tragic narrative preserved. Most obituaries spoke only of her suffering, not the harm she inflicted. But if Garland's contradictions troubled Sullivan, the next performer represented something even harder to reconcile. A man who preached fairness to children while enforcing segregation everywhere else. Number 2, Gene Autry. The singing cowboy who segregated everything. When Gene Autry appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, he looked like America's conscience in a cowboy hat. His on-screen cowboy code preached fairness, kindness, and helping those in need. Sullivan introduced him as a wholesome hero, a man whose values seemed beyond question. Behind that image stood a vast entertainment empire built on the opposite principle. From the 1940s through the 1970s, Autry owned radio stations, television productions, live events, and later a Major League Baseball team. Across all of them, former employees and production records documented systematic racial exclusion. Autry's radio stations enforced policies against playing music by black artists, regardless of popularity. A 1952 internal memo stated plainly that records by black performers would not be aired. His television productions maintained entirely white casts for years. Production documents show Autry personally approved casting. In more than a decade of programming, no black actor received a speaking role. Employees described unwritten but well-understood rules. Black workers were excluded from positions of authority or visibility. Traditional, one assistant recalled, meant white. Autry's rodeo events enforced segregated seating where legal. Unlike some touring productions that refused to perform under those conditions, Autry's management accepted and enforced local segregation without protest. In 1956, when asked to support integrated housing in neighborhoods where he owned property, Autry declined, citing concerns about property values, language civil rights activists recognized immediately. When Autry purchased the California Angels in 1961, the team became one of baseball's least diverse under his ownership. Black players later described the organization as unwelcoming and resistant to integration. Sullivan, who had grown up watching Autry's films, was disturbed by the disconnect between the cowboy code and the reality behind it. Privately, he began referencing Autry as a symbol of Hollywood hypocrisy. Autry died in 1998, his image largely intact. Most tributes celebrated his legacy, rarely mentioning the segregation that defined his empire. But even that hypocrisy was overshadowed by Sullivan's final regret, the one he never stopped thinking about. Number 1. Elvis Presley, the king built on black music, and the regret that lasted a lifetime. On September 9, 1956, more than 60 million Americans watched Elvis Presley step onto the Ed Sullivan stage. Sullivan had initially refused to book him. When he finally did, he didn't just showcase a singer, he crowned a king. Those appearances launched Elvis into superstardom and reshaped American culture. According to those closest to Sullivan, that booking became his deepest regret. Not because of Elvis's dancing, not because of controversy, but because of what Sullivan later learned. Elvis built his career on black music, blues, gospel rhythm, and blues learned on Beale Street in Memphis. Rock and roll itself was a black innovation Elvis popularized and profited from. But that debt rarely translated into advocacy. Multiple black musicians documented Elvis making dismissive or derogatory comments about black people, statements that reduced their value to what they could provide him musically. While some remarks were later denied, similar accounts emerged independently from musicians and staff over decades. What is not disputed is Elvis's silence. He never publicly credited the black artists who shaped his sound. He never used his influence to support integration. He avoided public association that might acknowledge black mentorship. Sam Phillips later acknowledged Elvis's discomfort discussing his influences. Little Richard repeatedly stated Elvis never publicly credited him. B.B. King noted Elvis was cordial, but distant. According to Graceland's staff, Elvis's personal life remained largely segregated. Black employees were mostly confined to service roles. On the Sullivan set, backstage staff documented Elvis's visible discomfort around black crew members during all 3 appearances. What troubled Sullivan most was the timing. Elvis rose during the Montgomery bus boycott, during Little Rock. At the dawn of the civil rights movement, no performer had more influence over young white America, and Elvis chose silence. By the 1960s, as Sullivan became more conscious of racial justice and intentionally elevated black performers, he began to understand what he had done. According to Sylvia Sullivan, Ed would watch civil rights coverage and quietly remark, "I made him America's idol," and he never once used that influence for good. In 1968, during Elvis's comeback special, NBC crew members documented Elvis objecting to black dancers in certain segments, preferring segregation by scene. The attitudes hadn't evolved. Sullivan died in 1974. Elvis followed in 1977. The crown remained. The contradictions remained buried. These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns. Pat Boone's sanitized theft, Kate Smith's patriotic exclusion, Perry Como's quiet erasure, Lawrence Welk's decades of all-white hiring, Sophie Tucker's blackface legacy, the Rolling Stones' selective respect, Judy Garland's backstage slurs, Gene Autry's segregated empire, and Elvis Presley, a kingdom built on borrowed ground. Ed Sullivan couldn't undo what he'd done, but he came to understand it. The man who introduced America to its heroes eventually recognized that some introductions were mistakes, moments when entertainment was chosen over justice. His stage was America's stage, and who we elevate tells us who we are.